Well, very, very happy Christmas and New Year to you, Andre, and nice to have you back on the Fighting Men of Rhodesia series.
It's also good to see you, my friend, and I hope you're well, and I hope your family are keeping well, but it's really good to see you. Now, Hannes, we've got quite a bit to cover in this video, and I presume we must go straight into it, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, Andre, you said you've had quite a big response to some of the points you made, which is good. That's what we're trying to do, is encourage a discussion and open it up as far and wide as possible. So will you just read out some of the questions that have come in and your response to them? I think that's very interesting.
Thanks, Hannes. I'll go as quickly as possible so we can get to the evaluation of that. Okay.
No problem.
Okay, Hannes.
No.
Okay, in this last video, we inadvertently touched on the aspect of hybrid operations. That's where we went. But in this interview, we want to deal with evaluating and assessing of Mapai. Now, Hannes, I'm aware that this content is more formal in nature and will appeal more to the military tacticians and strategists and senior commanders that aim to master the battlefield. And I also trust that my view, and it is my view, Hannes, anyone can disagree,
Sure.
but my view as an operator will help the viewers and my audience to perhaps reevaluate the efficiency and the effectiveness of many of our operations. You know, Hannes, there were many ops I was involved in, and just sitting here, I can instantly think of about 8 just from the top of my head in which I was involved. And they were really big operations that I think I'm quite able to assess. There's that Musha operation in October 78, west of Lusaka, where I think 120 of us killed about 1,000 terrorists.
In September 1978, the black nationalists scored a dramatic hit which shook Rhodesia. They downed a passenger aircraft on a flight from the holiday resort of Kariba. Whole families had been wiped out. Joshua Nkomo claimed his ZAPU forces had used a Russian-made missile to bring the plane down. The attack outraged the whites.
You know, in the war, a lot of things that are unacceptable will happen. That's what I can say.
Lusaka Tower, this is Green Leader. How do you read? I'm going to. Tower, this is Green Leader. This is a message for the station commander at Mumbai from the Rhodesian Air Force. We are attacking the terrorist base at Westlands Farm at this time. This attack is against Rhodesian dissidents and not against Zambia. Rhodesia has no quarrel, repeat, no quarrel with Zambia or her security forces. We therefore ask you not to intervene or oppose our attack. Did you copy all that?
At 8:30 on the morning of Thursday, 19th October 1978, the Rhodesian Air Force mounted a short, sharp and effective bombing attack on Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe People's Republican Army Operations Headquarters, known as FC Camp, situated at Westlands Farm, some 15 kilometers north of Lusaka in Zambia. It has been reported from Lusaka that hundreds of terrorists were killed and hundreds more wounded. There were no Rhodesian casualties from this raid, and all aircraft returned safely to their bases. At 12:45 the same day, Rhodesian security forces mounted a combined air and ground attack on Mkushi training base, situated some 150 kilometers to the northeast of Lusaka. camp was well established and efficiently laid out with both permanent structures and some 50 marquees. System that many of the inmates had to make do with foxholes for their personal protection. Casualties were as high as 1,500. Only one member of the Rhodesian security forces lost his life in this attack. Later the same afternoon, the Rhodesians mounted a third attack on a series of bases known as CGT, or Communist Guerrilla Training Camps, some 150 kilometers east of Lusaka, just off the Great East Road. It was obvious that word of the successful raids earlier in the day had reached the ears of the terrorists in CGT, and only token resistance was met. However, in the course of search and sweep operations, at least 50 more terrorists were killed. There were no members of the security forces killed in this attack. It is impossible to assess accurately the number of casualties suffered by the terrorists in all these operations. Even so, they are known to have been in excess of 1,000, and in the light of subsequent information coming out of Zambia, may run into several thousands.
There's Op Neutron, where we try to take out Tongarara and Nongo. There's the Beira Fuel Depot, March 79. There was Op Ecstasy on the 12th of May. That's where I did those halo jumps into northern Zambia. There's the Nchopi vehicle ambush. That's where I was ordered to capture some high-ranking Zandler officers. And if I remember right, we ended up killing 5 senior East German officers. And then there was Monte Shalova. That was the 12th of September. It was called the Tropperscatter, Hannes. That was a big communication center that we took out. And that was 110 kilometers west of Beira, in the Sofala province, if I can remember right.
Yes.
Then there's the new Chumoya camp on the 30th of September. And in the middle of this big new Chumoya camp, there's about 45,000 enemy terrorists, was a hill called Monte Cassino. So I went right into that. But coming out, we managed to kill 5 senior Russian officers as they're trying to get out of the camp. And then, of course, there's Op Tepid. You see, so we tried to attack that Zipra base in Zambia. But these are just some of the ops that instantly come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I just mentioned them, Hannes, because I was personally involved in them, and most of them were my ops. You know what I mean? I did the planning and tried to execute, you know, the goal, the aim. So I just thought I'd mention that to you. So I can speak to other ops, but this is the op particularly that I want to speak to. So Hannes, please may I again just answer some of those emails that some people have sent to me. And at the same time, I just want to mention some of what you said in the last video. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Go for it, Andre.
One, Hannes, you mentioned Mike West in your latest book and the dislike that the South African military showed towards us. Now, Hannes, I can personally confirm this truth. What you're saying is true, or what Mike is saying is true. Now, I was in Foreki. They specialized in seaborne operations. I was there for 2 weeks because they had to train me on the seaborne aspect, get into the Beira Fuel Depot. And Foreki called us the Philistines. Now, in case you don't know, in the Bible, the Israelites are the good guys, and the Philistines are the pagans. They're the bad guys. Now, I strongly object to that, you see. So I went to the commandant. I think, don't quote me, it's Colonel Breitenbach. And I said, Colonel Breitenbach, I object to you calling me a Philistine because I'm a Protestant Reformed man and I'm grounded in the Belgian Confession, the Heidelberg Confession, and the canons of Dort, which I knew. And now you're calling me a Philistine. And I said, I think, Colonel, that you guys are being hypocritical. He didn't take too kind to that, but he listened to me. And he asked why. I said, well, in the morning, what they do, Hannes, they'd have a prayer meeting. You see that fall in standard ease, and the commandant would read a passage from the Bible and they'd pray. But all in Afrikaans. They didn't invite us Philistines. They didn't invite the Rhodesians. And then after they finished, Hannes, they would leave and they'd swear like troopers. And in the evening, we'd get drunk and they'd get drunk as well. So I said, well, Christians don't do that. You see what I mean? I think that's hypocritical. But he sort of accepted that. But I did object to that. 2, the Guerrero sabotage of those 18 Hawk fighters that we destroyed amounted to about 8 to 10 million. So in today's value, in terms of inflation, I don't know what that would be. It's quite a bit. 3, one commentator asked me why I was so strict in the way that I required my men to deploy and move in the bush. Well, Hannes, generally my operations involved a very disciplined 2 to 3 day walking. I did that generally so that we weren't compromised. I didn't want the enemy to hear any helicopter or Dakota noise. That's why I would comfortably walk in 50 to 70 kilometers. That's how I worked it. And I only took very fit soldiers with me, Hannes, because I believed it was difficult to be alert, vigilant, and anti-track if you're unfit. And so I disliked, generally, I'm answering this person's question, I disliked taking soldiers who were clumsy in the bush, who were obese. There weren't many obese men in SAS, but there were a few. Anyone snored, or if there were push shots, I didn't want to take them because I wanted all my men to have a 2-inch grouping. So 2-inch grouping from 100 meters, that's the 2-inch grouping there. You see, that's what I wanted, that's how I wanted my men to shoot with the 2-inch grouping. And so my philosophy was that if you're not fit, you end up being a hazard to the rest of the call sign. Now, this brings me to Dick Stent. Dick Stent was my buddy. We were together at Pietermaritzburg University. In the residence there was Willie O'B. And there were about 10 of us subbies there together at that time. And Dick and myself, we used to train together. He was my training partner. He was a support commander.
Yeah.
He was in support command. So I'd go across the RLI gym, we'd meet up, and he was a very fit and a very strong man. And we'd run 2 to 3 times a week from RLI to the airport and back. But that's how fit we were. Now, Dick has passed away, since then. And so he's a guy that I sorely miss, but he was a very good fit operator. Then number 4, one commentator sincerely urges me that I must mention names since it will be safe to do so now. But it won't be safe to do so now, Hunt. My family are still in South Africa. My dad was a blast furnace, a molten steel specialist. And he worked at Palindaba and Valindaba, where they made all the gun barrels for the new artillery pieces in South Africa. Yes. And where, I think, Hannes, I stand under correction, I think they made 2 nuclear bombs using German physicists. Now, I tell you what, my dad was sent twice to Austria and Germany concerning this business. It was a very secretive affair. But I was allowed into those facilities because my dad, who had a very high clearance and access, got permission from the top director. He was a nuclear physicist. He was a doctor from Germany, and he allowed me to come in and to see basically what they were doing. So I was really, really very privileged to see that. I don't know of anyone else that could do that, but that was because of my dad. But I'm not sure about the nuclear bombs, but there was something suspicious.
And Andre, correct me if I'm wrong, but your dad was really self-taught, wasn't he? He came from Redcliffe. It's not as if he was a university-trained engineer or metallurgist. He learned from Redcliffe and then took his skills to South Africa.
Pure experience. He could just look at metal and tell you the constituents of the metal,
Amazing.
Just like 20, 30 years of experience.
Incredible.
And they wanted him. He was good. And he produced good gun barrels for, the artillery pieces.
Yeah. I think your dad was involved in those 5.5s, the big artillery pieces that they got towards the end. I seem to remember that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, Hannes, let's move on. Hannes, 5. You reminded me of South Africa's role in our demise. Now, you said, Hannes, I quote, South Africa blew hot and cold when it came to supporting Rhodesian politically and militarily. Now, I wholeheartedly agree with you, my friend. And I'm very aware of this, but I didn't mention it because, that wasn't the scope of my talk then. But, for example, in my rebuttal paper on the Rungwe, I wrote back then, and I quote, according to my South African intelligence sources, which operated at both national and international levels, they warned me that Foster, Botha, that's Pik Botha, General Liebenberg was selling us out for expediency's sake. I was warned like that. And Pik Botha categorically stated, and I quote, Mr. Smith thought that he could either win the war or he could negotiate for better conditions. My. What's wrong with that, Hannes? Why can't you think to win the war? And he was negotiating for better conditions. That's coming from the horse's mouth. So what Ian Smith was trying to do was looking for some bilateral mutual settlement. He wanted a negotiated settlement. And of course, that was very hard to obtain. But I don't think we can blame him for not trying to settle and agree and negotiate. He really was trying to do that. And that's what Botha is saying. And Botha goes on and he says, I did not agree and said that Smith had no chance of winning the war. What kind of ally is that? You see, so Botha did not agree. Now, Botha disliked Ian Smith, and he had no heart for Rhodesia, honestly, because we didn't, as he intimates, like the Boers. You see, we were Dutchmen. He thought we were too English. And Botha did sell Rhodesia in the hope that he could save South Africa, which he miserably failed in anyway. He claims, and I quote, South Africa didn't have money, and the burden had become too heavy, and Rhodesia was threatening South Africa's survival. Well, Hannes, you and I know all this is just false political messaging, but Botha did not like us and contributed. And I think we underestimate just the effect that South Africa's role had in our demise, in our struggle. Now, Hannes, a commentator asked me by criticizing the senior authorities, am I not belittling the Rhodesian cause? Now, that's serious. And I've responded by saying, I sincerely hope that I'm not doing that, because that is not my purpose. I'm a loyal Rhodesian. I'm a supporter of Ian Douglas Smith. I knew nothing else, and I followed the Rhodesian front. I'm not, in a wholesale manner, trashing the army or our national leaders. Rather, I'm trying to confront particular issues where I think we messed up in our military operations. And I know no one's perfect. No one has a 2020 vision, and we're allowed to make mistakes. But at the same time, we must be able to evaluate our mistakes where we went wrong. If we do that honestly, and like you said, we do it humbly. So that's my answer to that gentleman. Then, Hannes.
Andre, can I just, don't let me disrupt your train of thought, but I just want to interject quickly there. The two Bothas, Botha, you're absolutely right. I think he did not like Ian Smith on a personal basis, and that soured the whole relationship. And he had this very sort of antagonistic view to Rhodesia. But the same can't be said of P.W. Botha, who was lampooned as a buffoon and one thing or another. But he was the one who actually could see the big picture. And I think he deserves credit for that. You know, he could see that there were bigger issues at stake, and he understood the importance of supporting Rhodesia if South Africa was going to be able to withstand the onslaught. So sorry, I just wanted to mention that, because I do think it needs to be said. But
so maybe I've got the right word up there. Okay. Now, Hannes, listen quickly. I'm aware that there are some people who make it their business to criticize and demean the whole Rhodesian cause and display a strong dislike towards our political leaders and the Rhodesian army. For example, there is a book on the market that tries to promote local militia, the SFA, as the solution to the Rhodesian predicament. And I consider that a noble lie. The book essentially serves to promote foreign policy support for the historical British Politico. I've written several rebuttals, 6, I think, exposing the misinformation and disinformation contained in this book. And you can read about that on Facebook, these rebuttals. But the author presents a revisionist history on Rhodesia that essentially is presentist. The author gladly invokes the support of our arch enemies such as Owen, Stannard, Botha, Foster, McGuinness, Flower, and McNamara. And in a retributive and narcissistic way, he attacks the person and the reputation of our Prime Minister. And in a contemptuous way, he tries to blame the Rhodesian government and the army for getting everything wrong. And for me, that's like blaming the mirror because you don't like what you see. He writes and he states that, and I'm quoting you now, and this is public, Ian Douglas Smith displayed symptoms of hybrid. He did not heed professional advice. Ian Smith was UDI was an act of extreme self-righteous stupidity. Smith was a most unreflective man. He was blind to his own hypocrisy. and he was frequently delusional, unquote. So for me, Hannes, you speak about a dead man. That's assassinating his character. But essentially, the book is a monologue in which the author judges us, and while seeking to justify his betrayal and his treachery and his disloyalty, he tries to cover his guilt while blaming Rhodesia for failure. 6, Hannes. Someone asked, who is the bald-headed man next to me planning on the aircraft wing? If you look in the last picture, there's a guy next to me, headed in the photograph. He was a very good, astute, and professional soldier, and no doubt he's listening. But he used to carry around with him a sewing kit. I remember this, and he would constantly modify and upgrade his webbing. He was his own kind of tailor, but he was meticulous in his details.
Who's this you're talking about, Andre? Who was it?
Dr. John Borrowdale. He was a lieutenant with me. He's the guy next to me on the airplane wing planning. He's bending down. You see his bald head. And when I last stayed with him, it's a long time since I've seen him, and I've forgotten about John, but he's living in northern Natal in Kokstad, and I stayed there for the night, and some of his cattle went into the Lucerne paddock, and they got bloated, and they all died. So it was quite tragic. But all I'm trying to say, that's who he is Dr. John Borrowdale, and he was an excellent professional soldier. Number 7, one commentator asks me, what role did Darrell Watt have in shaping my military career? Well, Darrell was like a mentor to me. Hannes, I had many mentors. The main mentor was Bob McKenzie, because he gave me all the operational opportunities, more so than any other man. Then there was Dave. Now, Dave Berry, my side, had the most contacts in SAS. I don't think any man had more contacts than Dave Berry. And then, to a measure, Koos Lutz, who was the RSM or the SSM. But basically, Darrell and Dave Berry patiently had to put up with me and teach me the right way. And then, of course, eventually as we specialized, which I did, then I started operating independently, and I went my own way, separate from them. But I always had Dave Berry with me, generally. And Darrell had an incredible gift to both read the bush and interpret the move of the enemy. That's what I liked about Darrell. And I just want to remind you and the listener that I was never, and I'm not assuming to be in the same bracket as he was, or these 4 men, Bob, Dave, Koos, and Darrell, when it came to soldiering. You know, in Matthew 10:24, Jesus says, a disciple is not above his teacher. Well, these 4 men were my teachers. I was the disciple when it came to warfare. So, you know, I really acknowledge their role in training me. And they did. They actually spent a lot of time in training me. And I made many mistakes, Hannes, but that's how I started learning, from my mistakes. Who doesn't? So, Hannes, that's all I wanted to say about. Can I go into the post brief?
Yeah, Andre, so we were going to do one sort of last evaluation, I think, of Mapai. And you...
I do the post brief, evaluation, and my personal assessment. That's where I want to go, is the assessment. I'm in a rush to get. That was the duel. Okay, so the post brief. It's very interesting, Hans. Listen, on return to base, we were informed that after Canberra's bombing, the enemy withdrew to a prearranged RV on the railway line. True. Interestingly, some of us thought that after the bomb run, we could have taken Mapai. This all happened in the debrief. And for me, that was a bit idealistic, a bit fanciful. You see, it's like talking after the event. Talk is cheap. But the fact is that when we withdrew, the Freddies, or the terrorists, the Zandler guys, were still laying down heavy fire and shooting at us. And we had no intention of advancing. You can ask anyone in that assault line. Zandler's withdrawal was obviously post-bombing information and offered no real consolation for us, because even if we did remain and advance the following day, what purpose would it have served us? Because the enemy had vacated the camp. And I say the following day, Hannes, because after the bomb run, the enemy decided to withdraw from their trench positions during the night. And if my memory serves me right, I remember that we were told that the bombing wasn't quite on target, and it didn't do much damage and left many of the buildings and their vehicles still intact. Now, in our book, We Dared to Win, on page 129, Hannes and I quote from Professor Richard Wood. And I don't know Professor Wood. I don't know him. He's a respected man, but I don't know him. And he writes, I quote, in the biggest battle of the war, it appears that Rhodesians had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Close the quote. Now, this is a bit of a difficult statement for me, a bit of an amorphous statement to get meaning. But I think the idea here is that if we would have been victorious, but only waited until after the bomb run, and then advance because Zandler had withdrawn during the night. But I think, Hannes, the idea of victory has to be qualified, yeah, because in our situation at the time, it was an indefinite and nebulous reality. The truth is that the enemy withdrawal made our attack pointless and empty. For us, it meant that we could never encounter or make physical contact with the withdrawing enemy. Rick van Molson, he was an RLI lieutenant with me in RLI. I knew him quite well. He's a very respected lieutenant and a very brave soldier. He asks, the question needs to be asked, that if we had taken Mapai, what were we going to do with it? Was it our aim to occupy a position briefly, destroy it, and then return it to the enemy the next day? Is this really the jaws of victory that eluded us? You see, tactically, Zander's withdrawal was to their advantage, whether people like it or not. I think it was a good move on their part. I would have done the same, because it allowed them to afterwards consolidate and counterattack as it suited them from a position of their own choice, and that in their own country, because time was on their side. Listen to these wise words from Napoleon Bonaparte. He says, strategy is the art of making use of time and space. I'm never concerned about the latter than the former. Space we can recover, but lost time, never. In other words, Hannes, for us there at Mapai, we couldn't hang around forever because our goal was not territorial, occupational, as we presently see in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Our aim was to take Mapai, destroy it, the enemy, and then quickly return to Rhodesia. And we had serious military and geopolitical time constraints imposed upon us at the time. Now, in conventional warfare, Hannes, this is an important point. A basic principle of offense is to deal with the enemy's real line of communication. And our assault line approach, that's the approach we adopted, you see, to assault Mapai, without any stop groups behind Mapai, meant that the enemy were free to withdraw as they wished without us ever making contact with them. And we need to remember that holding lockstep isn't the same as fighting the enemy. Zander's withdrawal meant that they could abide their time, they could regroup and quickly gather reinforcements and launch counterattacks from the surrounding bush area. There was a huge amount of mobile reinforcements in the surrounding Gaza area that they no doubt would have called upon for help. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the goals set by COMOPS and our senior commanders did not make sense and served no real purpose, because we could have obtained the same outcome through aerial bombing alone without any forces on the ground. We wasted a lot of money, and it was my conviction that we could have obtained the same objective in another far more effective and easier way. Hannes, what I'm about to say now is critical. This is important, and I appeal to all viewers, my audience, and Rhodesians to listen carefully and to make their own assessment of what I'm going to say. Interestingly, or perhaps even sadly, I think that's the word I must use. Sadly, this was the same mistake we made in Optepid on the 18th of October, 1979, exactly 50 days later in Zambia, where we tried to attack another conventionally fortified base. But this time it wasn't Zandler, it was Zipra. Now, Zipra, believe it or not, also safely withdrew at night, just like they did at Mapai, because we acted on deficient intelligence. There was the minefield that we hadn't covered, we didn't know about, and then we did not cover the withdrawal route, the rear of the route that Zipra used to withdraw. And then at the same time, we tried to do a frontal assault like we attempted at Mapai.
Back to Zambia, north of Siavonga, Optepid, which was...
Yes, the misnomer of note, Optepid my ass, was the least tepid op I was ever on. Anyway, so it was November and they still had no rain up there. It was absolutely raging hot, and they'd spotted movement, clearings, all sorts of things on top of this ridge. It was called the ridge, actually, afterwards. And Zipra, not Bakshi operators. These are actually classically trained. When we got there afterwards, there were two ridges that were all trenched up, anti-aircraft up, supporting fire, radios, field telephones, everything. They sent a bunch of us. Again, I don't know whether it was 12 or 16, 3 or 4 sticks, maybe 16 of us. They said, okay, get in there and find out what's going on. The first day we went in and we were chilling and ambushed a bunch of guys coming through. There were no survivors, so we couldn't do any interrogation. But they had obviously heard this, and they didn't have their guys coming back to base. They said, right, they're hostile south of us, go and sort. And then we were getting closer in the middle of the night, and we got ambushed. A shitload of incoming. And John McLaurin, one of our English chaps, was hit in the back, I think. Kidney damage. Anyway, we had to stay put because he was really serious. But they couldn't get us out. We had to just stay put. But these blooming, they didn't move, eh? This chap was crying out in pain, and then when he was on the morphine, he was crying out about all sorts of funny things he was dreaming of. And every time he made a noise, this blooming sheet of red tracer, green tracer, everything came over us. And we were swapping pleasantries in such fashion for most of the night. And then the following day, John hadn't made it. I think his he'd bled out internally. And they said, okay, well, you guys in the area, I think we'll just hopscotch you straight onto the camp, and then you can have a real good look. I said, okay. They hopscotched us to the southern end of this ridge. Yes. And then the fun started. These guys, I mean, they said someone had taken a tactical blooming look at that thing and said, if the enemy comes from there, we need to hit it from such and such and such positions. They had it all sussed. As we popped our head over the ridge, Captain Cook was in, Lieutenant Cook, Bandit we called him, was in front. And he got clipped. Where? In the arse. Third arse entry for C Squadron. Wasn't good for morale. And then he reversed back down quickly. I think I was his radio man or his gunner or something. And he did this dramatic sort of left flanking. And down on the left flank was his old man Andy. He was dreadfully old, about 32, I think. Anyway, he'd been in the Brit SAS, and he certainly wasn't lacking in guts or aggression. And you just saw this curtain of dust and shrapnel, a tracer coming over the ridge, because they knew exactly where we were. And he was course on, zero, only getting you twos. He wasn't going anywhere, otherwise there would have been 4-0 straight away. So we sat there and wondered, and now? I said, well, you guys aren't getting any further on this. Best you come back. At least Captain Mac, Major Mac eventually, the late Mackenzie, had been flying over in a Lynx, and they caught a whole lot of shrapnel as well, which buggered up their undercarriage, and they had to belly land at FAF2 in Kariba. Anyway, he took a good look and made notes and said, okay, you guys get out of there. We'll have a think about this and get some more energy on it. So he crash landed back at FAF, and we had to run through the bush because the amount of anti-aircraft fire that was brought to bear, the choppers said, we'd help you out, but just a little bit further south, like even a bit further south than that. So we were smashing through the bush with these huge Bergens in 42-degree bloody heat. And these guys jumped out of their trenches and started following us. We could hear them shouting to each other. And we heard searching fire with the mortars, 1, 2, 3, 100 meters further, 1, 2, 3. They were awesome. So the tactical withdrawal at speed increased in speed. Some of the guys, I think 2 or 3, got heat fatigue. So then we couldn't leave them. We couldn't stop. We just relieved them of the burdens. And guess who got the burdens? The guys that didn't have heat fatigue. So we were now even more heavily burdened, charging through the bush, tactically withdrawing until we got to a landing zone and whipped back to Kariba. And they said, okay, we need a lot more ordnance and feet on the ground for this target. So I think one of the RLI commandos was called off R&R. They said, you thought you were going on R&R? Well, we're going to Kariba, but it's not going to be R&R. They got, I can't remember if it was all of squadron or two of the squadrons. Anyway, a whole bunch of us. And they said, right, now we're going to sort this ridge out. The RLI, who were better than us actually at sweeping and instinctive shooting and all that, they said, okay, they're going to just sweep. And we said, hey, we'll be watching. So they swept and ran into exactly the same stuff that we ran into. and the Blues were dropping us whatever they could drop on them. Couldn't dislodge these buggers, eh? Yo. My good friend Chisel Carpenter I can't remember what he did, but something heroic. He got the BCR that day. They lost 1 man or 2 men. And the anti-aircraft fire was horrendous because it was coordinated. It wasn't just gunner by gunner. They were talking to each other, saying the choppers are coming in from the southeast. Here's the flak curtain. So the Blues tried their best, but they couldn't really help us that much, eh? And that night, they'd had such a rev, the zipper, I mean, that they decided to move camp, but not just scuttling into the bush. They did a column withdrawal, and they took some of the heavy weapons with them. Still fully disciplined, the brass at Kariba looked at the map, and they said, okay, we've got stops here, 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 here. What about that spot there? I said, oops. So they just scraped a call sign together as quickly as they could, took the RLI int officer with bottle washers and sick, lame and lazy, said, okay, here's 12 Oaks, get out there and you know, be ready. So he was dropped, and guess where it came? Through that very spot. Anyway, the man on the ground, he made the call, and after having come up against these guys, I don't blame him. His call was, we're not going to engage. Otherwise, we're going to be wiped out. These people, they do sweep lines. There are bloody hundreds of them walking past this position. They're super aggressive. And here I am with a bunch of guys I've never worked with before. Some are even bottle washers. And he just said, you know, the plus minus of the situation is I can lose half my men for what? Anyway, so they got out. And he took serious flack after that as a result of not engaging them. But, you know, that's how it goes. It was his decision. And personally, I think I would have made the same one. But you don't know until you're there. Eh? Anyway, the brass was not impressed with him. And he took a lot of flack on that account. That was the end of Op Burek. I mean, where were we? Tepid, the dreaded Tepid. The Ridge, we never displaced them. Well, temporarily. But they were disciplined, tough, bloody reactionary troops. Not anything the like of which we'd come up against before.
And for me, Hannes, this reflects inside the box kind of thinking. The mentality here is cut from the same cloth that we used at Mapai. And I can speak much more comprehensively on the tactical aspect of Op Tep than I can speak of Op Mapai, because there I led the whole squadron in the salt line, and that's where I was wounded. And there too, we saw a faulty strategy on the zipper camp coming to the fore. I had personal feedback afterwards from 2 senior officers involved in this aerial reconnaissance that I considered to be very ineffective and incomplete. And during our discussion, they themselves admitted to this flaw. And one of the officers, I can't mention his name because he has since passed away, who did the reconnaissance was Captain Bob McKenzie. And so here's my take. ComOps using old tactical methods that previously worked, but no longer so effective as the war progressed and developed. They forgot that the enemy were being better equipped and trained, and they had Russian and Chinese advisors on the ground. Now, Hannes, besides that, there were very positive outcomes that came out of the post brief. I'll just mention that. We all arrived back home safely, for which I thank the Lord. 2, the Barragem attack created temporary economic problems for Mozambique. And from a military perspective, it did set Zanla insurgency back for a while, just a few weeks, by the way, and it affected their logistics. And 3, I think the biggest success to Op Burek was political, because Samora Michel forced Mugabe to the conference table at Lancaster House after this attack, and we all know the outcome of that anyway. So, Hannes, that's the debrief aspect. Now, Hannes, when it comes to evaluations, please understand that these are not my evaluations. So I'm taking them from other sources, from literary sources, from books. And interestingly, a lot of people evaluated the operation mainly from the perspective of its outcome, from its result, and not from the operational side. They tended to neglect the bigger strategic operation, the bigger picture of what Operation Burek accomplished. And many views were given, especially about our withdrawal, because that was the sensitive point. You know, the way we left was a bit of a sore point amongst us soldiers. So there's quite an emphasis on their withdrawal when it came to evaluating Op Pi. And I thought that some of the evaluations were justified, Hannes, and carried some truth. But I was a bit ambivalent on some of the views that were being expressed. For example, Colonel Barrett, he was the CEO of SAS. Darrell and myself inquired, we made inquiry, and he responded to us by saying, as usual, I quote, we have many armchair generals voicing their opinion. But ultimately, Hannes, if you think about this carefully, the issue goes far beyond about voicing one opinion. It's about being honest and speaking the truth about the actual situation. And in all fairness, not all the evaluators were armchair generals, Hannes, because some of them were very professional, educated, and experienced soldiers. Some of them had far more experience than the CO. Many operators were honestly and objectively reporting what they experienced as operators on the battlefield. So we can't just call them armchair generals. Now, I just want to mention some of the views that were mentioned, okay, Hannes, in these reviews. So I'm just going to tabulate them quickly, Hannes, to get on to the assessment. A, we could have persevered and eventually taken Mapai. That was one evaluation. Well, this possibility for me was just hopeful conjecture. Remember our situation? We were a foreign country surrounded by hostile forces, and we were who were able to draw on reinforcements very quickly. Now, it was admitted by an SAS officer, and I quote, the advance had grounded to a halt due mainly to the effectiveness of the Russian-designed trench systems and the exceptionally heavy and disciplined fire being directed at the advancing troops. End of quote. Now, the review says we could have persevered and eventually taken Mapai. Now, here's the question, Hannes. If our time limit was critical, then how was the idea of us eventually taking Mapai supposed to work out? If these guys were really entrenched in their trenches, it wouldn't have worked. Peter Bauer, he wrote a book, in his book, Winds of Destruction. He states, close quarter back contacts in the face of intense enemy fire, every conceivable type and caliber of weapon. I don't think that's quite accurate. It wasn't that heavy, that bad. Proved the Rhodesian troops' ability to cope with a heavy enemy fire. That's fair. But the target was just too complicated to be overrun. General Ward soon realized that Mapai could not be taken easily. End of quote. Well, I think, Hannes, that's quite an accurate and realistic statement. B, another review said, ComOps did not want to further damage public morale. So this is another review. Hannes, this was one of the main reasons given to justify our withdrawal, public morale. But surely, if you think about it, the truth is that by withdrawing, we were further damaging public morale. It showed Rhodesians that the nature of our war was changing and that we no longer were so dominant in the battlefield. The enemy were making good progress, and we no longer had that big advantage. That's what it told me. And the answer to solve the problem, as far as I was concerned, would have been for ComOps, in the first instance, to have planned better and more effectively. The morale problem was not so much the men we lost or the withdrawal as it was about the incompetency of some of our senior ranks. C, the aim was never to actually take Mapai, but merely exploit its defenses. Now, that was what one review stated. And I think this is an absurd objective. I've never heard of it before. None of the men knew about or ever heard about this kind of aim. The aim was never to actually take Mapai, but merely to exploit its defenses. Before deploying, we were given explicit orders to kill the enemy and take Mapai. We dressed like that. We dressed appropriately. You'll see that in the pictures. But this really is quite a ridiculous and insipid aim. Why, Hannes, would I risk my life and enter those trenches for trying to exploit the enemy defenses? Now, that word exploit means to make full use of something and to benefit from it. And as far as I was concerned, there were many other ways to exploit the enemy defenses at minimal cost, which I'll explain later. D, the loss of the 17 men earlier influenced the general's decision to call a halt to the assault. Now, of course, I do commiserate on this point about my fallen fellow soldiers. The loss was tragic. But the immediate or main reason to withdraw was firstly, as it always had to be, militarily. We were fighting a war. We were involved in combat. And the sentiment given about caring for the men or about public morale or about our early casualty rate might have influenced the general in his decision, but I don't believe that they were of first importance. And according to my reasoning, the primary role of a fighting general was always to marshal his troops in order to win the battle. The general was no fool, I hope, and he must have realized the futility and the implication of us trying to obtain a victory in the light of our defective tactical approach. For me, the general's command to withdraw served to show the embarrassing ineptitude of our high command to plan effectively for this kind of mission. You know, the simple truth is this, Hannes, that 150 lightly equipped infantry soldiers could not beat the enemy in their defensive stronghold. Napoleon said, God is on the side with the best artillery. The Mapai attack was a defensive op to protect Rhodesia from insurgent influx from the east. Well, as far as I'm concerned, this is a very unconvincing and ambivalent statement. Both Ian Smith and General Walls said the operation essentially was a defensive one. Smith said, quote, in order to adequately defend our people, we had to go across and eliminate the guerrillas in their bases. So it was a defensive exercise. There was nothing aggressive about it, end of quote. Now think soberly about this. So we eliminate the guerrillas, and really, there's nothing aggressive about this. Well, I leave that up to your imagination. Now, it is true that in one sense, strategically and nationally, it was a defensive move to protect our borders and the terrorists' access into Rhodesia. But operationally and tactically, it was an offensive assault. And to say that there was nothing aggressive about it, those are the words, nothing aggressive about it, I think is not an accurate statement, which our leaders should have phrased better. Imagine we killed 300 enemy in Op with no aggression. What fighting soldier will think in such an absurd way? So that's the end, Hannes, of the evaluations. May I move on to the assessment? My assessment of the op might be a bit political. I accept that for some people. But I'd like to speak from my personal experience of the war. You know, the truth is not always easy to accept. And there's a saying, you cannot make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. In other words, to admit the truth, we have to accept our mistakes as well. And for me, our withdrawal meant that we did not accomplish our objective. As simple as that. Yes, perhaps we could have taken Mapai. I don't doubt that. But I argue not in the way that we tried to do it. That's argument, not in the way that we tried to do it. The withdrawal itself didn't concern me that much because it didn't mean that we had been defeated. Rather, it meant that we did accomplish what we had set out to do, namely capture and destroy Mapai. You know, there's a saying that goes, for he who fights and runs away might live to fight another day. So that's fair to withdraw, and we're available for another day. Ecclesiastes 9:4 in the Bible, for those who know, says a living dog is better than a dead lion. At least you can fight again if you're a living dog, but if you're a dead lion, well, that's it. And the truth is this, many of our post-evaluations, in a way, served as poor excuses for our failure to plan properly. And some of the people were denying the reality of the situation. They were ignoring the true result of the operation. And I argue that the Mapai outcome can directly be attributed to poor tactical, ineffective military planning coming from our senior commanders. It had nothing to do with our soldiering ability. Think about it. To try and deal with a brigade headquarters using only light infantry, armed with light weapons, in an assault role, without any artillery support, without any form of envelopment in place in the rear, could not work, and simply was not effective.
Or armor. I mean, they had armor available to them, which they chose not to use.
Yes, they could have used that to attack Mapai. And so I think, Hannes, we deployed light infantry to attack a brigade headquarters, and it just didn't make sense. Now, Alex Binder, I think you might know him. I don't know Alex Binder. He wrote an article. It's called Reconstructing Op Uri. Now, I agree with Alex Binder, and he writes, and I quote, the Rhodesians were to set up a ring of ambushes on all access routes around the base in the hope that the fleeing enemy would run into them, thereby achieving a good kill rate. With the benefit of hindsight, had this plan been retained, This is exactly what would have happened. However, the decision to change the ambushing force into an attacking force was made later for a number of different reasons. And without plunging pen into dispute, I must recall that it is around this decision that controversy over Europe is centered. So the decision to change from an ambushing force into an attacking force, honestly, okay, you can't see him. Okay. Listen.
Bye-bye, Opa.
Bye-bye, my darling. Bye-bye. Sorry, it's my grandchildren. But Hannes, to change fight from an ambushing force into an attacking force, we must question, why was this change made? There's no discussion, there's no notification, we are not aware of it, and we weren't consulted. John Fairley of the Rhodesian Army Association states, after an operation on foreign territory, it is easier to assess one's failure than one's successes. Well, I don't know about it, but that's what he says. And after the operation came the recrimination. Many army officers alleged that the operation had been badly planned. It was said that generals, who should have been concerned solely with the strategic aspect of the operation, involved themselves with tactical considerations, which should have been left to the commanders in the field. Again, Hannes, think carefully about this tactical aspect. And I do, I appeal to my audience, I appeal to my viewers, I appeal to my listeners, I appeal to Rhodesians. The main issue is this. If we chose to do a frontal assault on Mapai, as we did, then two tactical requirements were absolutely necessary for a victory. I would have organized this as a lieutenant, Hannes. Oh, my darling. My darling, I was just talking. This is my one grandson, Hannes. Just Uncle Hannes. Say hello, Hannes.
All right.
Say hello.
What's his name?
Okay. What's your name? Say it's Finn. It's Finn. Okay. There you go. Thank you, Jason. They love Opa, Hannes. That's the story. But Hannes, two tactical requirements were absolutely necessary for a victory. If we chose to do frontal assault on Mapai. One, we needed organized firepower, Hannes, directed from the ground, not the air, in support of frontal engagement like tanks, artillery, and mortars. And two, we needed an ambushing force and stop groups to the rear of Mapai. We had to contain them to block the exits. And I think, honestly, and I said humbly, Hannes, we failed in both these requirements. Firstly, the frontal engagement was inadequate. The enemy had fortified their positions, and they were resolved to fight and defend their position. The nature of the battle demanded greater firepower from us in order for us to gain territorial possession of the trenches. Two, we did not secure the rear of the camp. Now, I know that we didn't have much manpower, but stop groups and ambushes in the rear of Mapai should have been an integral part of our attack. The enemy's withdrawal meant that they were left unchecked and unchallenged, and even if we did take Mapai, Hannes, it meant that we would have taken an empty set of buildings. Tactically, our attack was quite meaningless, simply because it was impossible to make contact with the enemy. If they were retreating, how were we supposed to kill them? Is this really a victory? Even more concerning, Hannes, our attack was quite meaningless, simply because it was impossible to make contact with the enemy. If they were retreating, I've already said that, sorry, how are we going to kill them? But even more concerning, this is the point I was meant to say, that taking an empty brigade headquarters, it meant that we made ourselves quite vulnerable to the Lima counterattack. And this was a very real danger. And of course, the enemy would use the open rear to their advantage to attack us. See, the Freddies had mobile deployments in the area, and they had many 12.7 guns, had many RPG-7s, and they had lots of mortars and lots of possible Strellas. And our location was pretty fixed in the camp area. And any attack from the enemy from outside the camp perimeter using rockets and mortars would have made our position untenable and, to say the least, very unpleasant. And just to remind you, the Freddies were pretty good with their 2-inch mortars. I speak from experience because I've been mortared by them on at least 2 occasions. That photograph, I think John will put it in. You see running. It's a photograph taken by Corporal Chunky Chesterman. They're trying to mortar us. And I was trying to run to get away from the mortar fire because once you have the ping, you've got about 40 seconds. You've got to make a move. And the idea was, the lesson from that was we had to get out of their sight. Because if they had us visual, they were trying to mortar us. But if you could hide from them and get out of sight, not out of range, out of sight, then the mortar fire became more random and scattered and spread as it did. But they knew our position in the camp, but we didn't know their whereabouts in the surrounding bush. And this also meant that it would have been difficult to call in airstrikes, Hannes, support, because their position was unknown to us. Also, the pilots would have been hesitant to fly over a hot area, not knowing what ground-to-air missiles was waiting for them in the surrounding area. Now, here is what I want to say. I think, Hannes, COMOPS had severely messed up on their planning when it came to Op Mapai and Op Tebet, but that's another issue. As already mentioned, instead of dealing with the strategic aspect of war, COMOPS was too involved with the tactical issues, which should have been left to the leaders on the ground. And here's the question. Was it truly necessary and wise to have Walsh and Robertson, not so much Robertson, because he's quite junior, all together in one aircraft in a local battle? Imagine if that Dakota got taken out. I know they were off the area, but just they could be taken out because they were Philima in all that Gaza area. As commanders of the armed forces of Rhodesia, that was a Walsh and Walls, was their place to be commandeering a local operation. What about the rest of the Rhodesian army, those in the west and the east and north and the south of Rhodesia? What about the nation's security? What about all the other military units in the country that needed our support and our well-being and the general's input? Who was commandeering and strategizing the national situation in this instance? And the truth is, the war had progressed, and they were still using old tactics that worked in the past, and they're trying to apply it to new military developments. And simply put, that what we tried to attack Mapai was wrong. And my conviction then, Hannes, not now, was that we should have simply have bombed the camp and left the after effects with the enemy to sort out. That's what I was having to do. I think that aerial bombing would have been sufficient to temporarily halt Zandler from using Mapai as an operational center. And if Zandler later reoccupied Mapai, we could again bomb them by surprise with precision accuracy from 20,000 feet, because we had intelligence and we had the capability and we had the lockstep. But I'm sure that Zandler would have moved, and they would have set up another base elsewhere, like they did in the new Chimoya. So, Hannes, I knew Mapai area quite well. I did a lot of deployments in that area under Captain Bob McKenzie. And in many encounters with the Philima in the surrounding area, they were quite knowledgeable in what they were doing. With minimal ado, I believe a small SAS call sign could have done a close-up recce of Mapai, or even a perimeter recce, set up a RAD, and direct Canberras in for a bomb run at night. We could have repeatedly done this because as clandestine operators, we had the flexibility to move around and remain undetected and even to anti-track. Remember, Hannes, our aim was not one of occupation, nor was a tactical approach one of envelopment, like we did in all those other extents, which we should have done. The fact that we did not have the means to contact the enemy posed a real problem for us because we couldn't hang around in the area for an extended period of time. We were in a foreign country, surrounded by many hostile forces, and the aim was to get out as quickly as possible using helicopters. And even there, I wouldn't have used the helicopters like they use them. We've got the men, RLI and SAS, to walk back 50 kilometers. That was nothing for me, and deploy and get uplifted from there. And I believe General Wall's decision to withdraw wasn't firstly about a morale issue, but about the battle outcome. It was not primed on sentiment, but in essence, it was a strategic decision, because to be a good general, it had to be this. And here's the punchline, Hannes. The general decided to withdraw because he saw the futility of trying to traverse hundreds of meters of trenches only to capture a physical headquarters, which on entry would have been vacated. It truly was a pointless and useless goal or aim. So in closing, Hannes, another major problem, I just want to touch it briefly, I believe was our intelligence. You know, if our intelligence on the enemy strength in Mapai was accurate, then it should have been a major factor in determining how we were going to attack in order to accomplish our objective. Perhaps our intelligence on the strength of the enemy in Mapai was incorrect. I'm not saying it was, but perhaps it was. It might have been correct. I don't know. But in either case, whether our intelligence was correct or incorrect, the variable of the enemy strength should have been a major factor built into our tactical planning. So that's really, Hannes, all I want to say about Op Mapai.
Yeah, well, thanks.
So,
I think we've covered it in quite a lot of detail. I don't have much to add, but I do think criticizing the fact that Norman Walsh was there and General Walls, I think people of that seniority needed to be there. This was one of the great big battles of the Rhodesian War. There was a lot at stake. Whether they made the right calls or not is another issue, but I don't think you can criticize them for being there. And the fact that they were in the same aircraft, probably, but as you know, we didn't have resources, weren't plentiful, so these things happen. But I do recall Brian Robinson saying at some stage it was a mistake at Chamoil because he and Walsh were in the same helicopter at Chamoil, and that was shot down. And so for a period of time, the command element was neutralized and out of action, which wasn't ideal.
That's what worried me, Hannes. You said they shot the big case.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, I think if they were involved with the strategic aspect and left the ground operation to the forces on the ground, I think it would work better. That was just my take on that operation, because I was worried about what was happening back in Rhodesia, the morale back in Rhodesia.
Yeah, sure.
And I think the men out there in Rhodesia needed much more support from our senior officers, input and direction. And
well, at that stage, Andre, everything was pretty thin on the ground. Resources was being stretched, and pressure was mounting from all sides. So, yeah, I don't know about that. But Andre, thanks again for your time and all the valuable input. I appreciate it.
Okay, and you have a good day, my brother. Okay, my friend, you have a good day.
Good man, Andre. We'll be in touch.
Okay, Hannes. Bye-bye, Hannes.
Thanks, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers, Hannes. Bye.